When most people picture the American cowboy, a single image comes to mind. A white man on horseback, silhouetted against a dusty sunset. It's an image repeated for generations in films, television, and textbooks. But history tells a far more complex and far more powerful story. Long before Hollywood shaped the myth of the Wild West, black cowboys were already riding the open range, shaping the culture, skills, and survival of frontier life. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys during the peak of the American frontier were African American. These men were not side characters. They were expert horsemen, fearless cattle drivers, trailblazers, ranch hands, rodeo innovators, and community leaders. They broke wild horses, guided massive cattle drives across unforgiving terrain, and helped build an industry that defined a nation. Yet their stories were quietly pushed aside, replaced by a simplified legend that erased their presence. This story isn't about rewriting history, it's about restoring it. It's about the people whose labor, courage, and skill laid the groundwork for what the world now calls the American West. From the aftermath of slavery to the rise of the open range, black cowboys found freedom, dignity, and identity on horseback. Even while facing discrimination and exclusion off the trail. On the range, ability mattered more than skin color. Survival demanded trust, teamwork, and respect. In this video, we uncover the truth behind the cowboy myth. You'll meet real figures whose lives rival any Western movie hero. You'll learn how black cowboys influenced rodeo, music, language, and frontier culture, and why their legacy was nearly erased from popular memory. If you value real history, untold stories, and perspectives that challenge what we think we know, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Because black history is not separate from American history, it is at the very heart of it. The image of the cowboy did not appear out of nowhere, and it certainly did not begin with Hollywood. Long before the open range became a symbol of freedom and rugged independence, the skills that defined cowboy life were already being practiced by enslaved Africans across the American South. In the early 1800s, cattle were wealth, land was power, and survival depended on those who could master animals stronger, faster, and more dangerous than themselves. That responsibility fell overwhelmingly on black men whose labor sustained plantations, ranches, and entire regional economies. On sprawling estates in places like Louisiana and Texas, enslaved Africans were tasked with managing livestock that roamed freely across unfenced land. They learned how to track herds through dense brush, calm frightened animals, pull calves from mud, treat injuries, and break wild horses that resisted every human touch. These were not simple chores, but highly specialized skills passed down through experience, observation, and necessity. The work demanded courage, endurance, and judgment, because a single mistake could cost a life. Over time, these men became indispensable, trusted to work independently, ride long distances alone, and make decisions that protected both cattle and property. As cattle ranching expanded westward, especially in Texas, the demand for these skills grew. Many enslaved black men worked alongside Mexican vaqueros, absorbing techniques of roping, riding, and animal handling that would later become central to cowboy culture. They rose before dawn, rode until nightfall, and slept beneath open skies, living a life that would later be romanticized but was, in reality, shaped by hardship and discipline. The term cowboy itself emerged in this period, originally used to describe black cattle workers, a reflection of how closely the identity was tied to their labor. When the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, the open range did not disappear. In fact, it expanded. Ranchers returning from the war found herds scattered and unmanaged, and the only people with the knowledge to restore order were the very men they had once enslaved. Freedom did not erase inequality, but it did transform opportunity. For many newly freed black men, cowboy work offered something rare in post-war America: paid labor, mobility, and a measure of independence. On horseback, skill mattered more than background, and survival depended on competence rather than status. These former slaves carried their expertise into the heart of the frontier, driving cattle across rivers, plains, and mountains. Sometimes for months at a time, they became trail hands, horse breakers, cooks, scouts, and leaders within crews. The daily rhythm of cowboy lifelong rides, shared meals, nights by the fire was built on traditions forged during slavery and refined through years of lived experience. What later generations would call the spirit of the West was, in many ways, shaped by men who had known bondage and sought dignity through mastery of their craft. Yet as the legend of the cowboy took shape in popular culture, this origin story was quietly stripped away. The labor that formed the foundation of the cattle industry was separated from the image that represented it. Films, novels, and advertisements recast the cowboy as a lone white hero, disconnected from the history that made his world possible. What remained was a myth polished for mass consumption, while the truth faded into the background. Understanding where the cowboy tradition truly began does not diminish the West. It deepens it. It reveals a history rooted not just in adventure, but in resilience, knowledge, and survival against overwhelming odds. The men who learned to command horses and herds while denied control over their own lives helped create one of the most enduring symbols in American history. Their story is not an addition to the cowboy narrative. It is the ground on which that narrative stands. When freedom finally arrived in Texas in the summer of 1865, it did not come with land, wealth, or guarantees. Juneteenth marked the end of legal bondage, but for many formerly enslaved black men, survival still depended on the same hard-earned skills they had carried through years of forced labor. The difference now was choice. What had once been coerced became contracted, and the open range offered one of the few paths where experience could be exchanged for wages. In the fragile aftermath of the Civil War, the cattle industry needed rebuilding, and it was black cowboys who quietly made that recovery possible. Texas emerged from the war with vast herds roaming uncontrolled across open land. Barbed wire had not yet reshaped the frontier, railroads were still expanding, and ranchers lacked the manpower to reclaim their livestock. The men who knew how to do this work were already there. Formerly enslaved cowboys understood cattle behavior, could ride for days without relief, and had spent years managing herds with minimal supervision. Faced with economic reality, ranch owners turned to them not as property, but as professionals. Pay was modest, conditions were harsh, yet the work offered autonomy that few other occupations allowed black men during Reconstruction. On the trail, the past mattered less than performance. Cattle drives required discipline, teamwork, and trust, because mistakes endangered everyone involved. Former slaves rode beside white cowhands, Mexican vaqueros, cabecintonas, and native workers, forming crews bound by shared risk rather than shared background. The long journeys north toward Kansas railheads tested endurance through heat, storms, hunger, and exhaustion. Days blurred into one another as riders watched for strays, protected herds from thieves, and guided thousands of animals across rivers and plains. In these spaces, skill earned respect, and for many black cowboys, the trail became the first place where their abilities defined their worth. Payment brought more than wages. It brought movement. Black cowboys could leave plantations behind, follow seasonal work, and choose where to ride next. Some saved enough to buy horses, cattle, or small parcels of land. Others used their earnings to support families or begin new lives in growing frontier towns. While discrimination remained deeply rooted in American society, the cattle industry offered a rare environment where merit could briefly outweigh prejudice, especially far from towns and courts. As the post-war beef market expanded, so did opportunity. Demand for cattle soared, railroads pushed west, and ranching became one of the most profitable industries in the country. Black cowboys were everywhere along this expansion, driving herds through multiple states, managing remudas of horses, cooking for trail crews, and training young stock. Their experience shaped daily routines, trail techniques, and unwritten rules that defined cowboy life. What later generations would recognize as the culture of the West was refined during these years, in camps and crossings guided by men who had once been denied ownership of their own labor. Yet freedom did not erase barriers. In towns, black cowboys often faced exclusion from lodging, dining, and public spaces. Advancement was limited, and leadership roles were rare. Still, on the range, they found a measure of dignity that Reconstruction politics often failed to deliver. The saddle became both a workplace and a symbol, representing movement in a nation still struggling to accept black independence. By the late 19th century, the foundations of the modern cattle industry were firmly in place, built through relentless labor during its most unstable years. The transition from slavery to paid work did not simply change the lives of black cowboys. It preserved an entire industry at a moment when it might have collapsed. Their contribution was not symbolic. It was practical, physical, and essential. In the space between bondage and belonging, these men helped carry the American West into a new era, shaping its economy, its culture, and its enduring legend through skill, endurance, and hard-won freedom. As the cattle industry stabilized and the open range matured, a new stage emerged where skill was no longer measured only by survival on the trail, but by performance before a crowd. Rodeos and Wild West shows became a way for cowboys to display the techniques they had refined through years of labor. And it was here that some black cowboys transformed frontier work into spectacle. Among them, Bill Pickett and Nat Love stood out, not only for their talent, but for how they shaped the very image of what a cowboy could be, even as the society around them tried to limit their recognition. Bill Pickett's rise began far from applause. Like many black cowboys, he learned his craft through daily work on ranches, handling unpredictable cattle that required strength, timing, and nerve. Watching how ranch dogs subdued steers, Pickett adapted the method for human performance, developing what became known as steer wrestling. When he leapt from his horse, seized a charging steer, and brought it to the ground with practiced control, audiences witnessed something entirely new. This was not theater invented for entertainment. It was real ranch work transformed into art. Pickett's technique spread rapidly, becoming a cornerstone of modern rodeo and forever changing the sport's direction. Despite his fame, Pickett's path was shaped by barriers. Segregation kept him out of many competitions and forced him into separate circuits. Yet his reputation crossed borders. He performed across the United States and abroad, appearing in Wild West shows and early motion pictures that carried his image to audiences who had never seen the frontier. Long after his death, the rodeo world acknowledged his influence, but during his lifetime, recognition came unevenly, shadowed by exclusion that did nothing to diminish his impact. While Pickett reshaped rodeo, Nat Love preserved the lived experience of the trail itself. Born into slavery and freed as a teenager, Love headed west in search of opportunity, armed with literacy, ambition, and hard-won skill. On the cattle drives, he earned a reputation as a gifted rider, shooter, and roper, capable of handling the most demanding tasks. His life on the range mirrored the legends later celebrated in fiction. Yet Love did something rare. He wrote it down. Through his autobiography, he documented frontier towns, long drives, competitions, and encounters that revealed the everyday reality behind the myth. Love's writing offered a voice to men who were often seen but rarely heard. He described a world where danger was constant, where camaraderie formed under pressure, and where black cowboys navigated both opportunity and discrimination. Though celebrated for his abilities, Love still faced exclusion from certain events and institutions, reminders that fame did not erase racial boundaries. Even so, his story traveled beyond the range, shaping how later generations understood the West not as a fantasy, but as a lived experience. Together, Pickett and Love represented two sides of the same legacy. One turned physical mastery into a lasting sport, the other turned memory into history. Their achievements did not exist in isolation. They emerged from a community of skilled black cowboys whose labor had already defined the industry. What made these men exceptional was not only talent, but timing. They stood at a crossroads when the frontier was becoming legend, and they left marks that could not be easily erased. Yet as Western films and novels gained popularity, the stories of men like Pickett and Love were pushed to the margins. The cowboy image narrowed, simplified, and reshaped for mass appeal, leaving behind those who did not fit the preferred mold. Still, the techniques Pickett introduced remain central to rodeo today, and Love's words continue to offer first-hand insight into a world otherwise filtered through fiction. Their lives remind us that the history of the American West was not written by myth alone. It was lived by real people whose contributions shaped industries, sports, and culture, even when denied equal platforms. Black cowboys like Bill Pickett and Nat Love carried the frontier forward, leaving legacies that endure wherever horses run, crowds gather, and the story of the West is told. As the frontier evolved from lived reality into legend, the space available to black cowboys quietly began to shrink. Their skills had helped rebuild the cattle industry after the Civil War. Their labor had carried herds across thousands of miles, and their talent had shaped rodeo itself. Yet recognition did not grow alongside their contributions. Instead, new barriers emerged, subtle at first, then increasingly rigid, reinforcing a system that allowed black cowboys to work but rarely to advance, to perform but not to belong. On the range, cooperation remained a necessity. A cattle drive could not survive without trust, and ability often outweighed prejudice when lives and livelihoods were at stake. But once the trail ended and towns appeared on the horizon, the rules changed. Black cowboys who had shared campfires and responsibilities with white cowhands often found themselves barred from hotels, restaurants, and social spaces. Wages were frequently lower, opportunities for leadership limited, and advancement constrained by unspoken boundaries. Even those whose reputations were well known learned that skill did not guarantee fairness. Rodeos, which had once offered a stage where talent spoke loudly, began to reflect the wider divisions of society. As the sport became more organized and profitable, access narrowed. Black cowboys were denied entry to certain competitions, excluded from associations, or quietly pushed into separate events with fewer resources and less visibility. Some were forced to perform under assumed identities. Others watched from the sidelines as techniques they had helped popularize were celebrated when performed by someone else. The applause remained, but the doors closed more often than they opened. Beyond exclusion lay danger. Competition bred resentment, and excellence sometimes drew hostility rather than respect. There were moments when success invited retaliation, when victories were questioned or undermined, and when envy escalated into intimidation. These experiences were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern that reminded black cowboys of the limits placed upon them. Regardless of how well they performed, the frontier promised freedom, yet it carried the same prejudices that shaped the rest of the nation. As the open range declined and barbed wire reshaped the West, the cowboy itself began to transform into a cultural symbol. Books, traveling shows, and eventually films took the raw material of frontier life and molded it into entertainment. In that process, the image of the cowboy became narrower, cleaner, and more marketable. Black cowboys, native cowhands, Sevilla, and Mexican vaqueros faded from view, replaced by a single heroic figure who represented only part of the truth. The labor that had built the industry was separated from the story that celebrated it. This erasure extended into education. Textbooks simplified history, focusing on expansion and conquest while overlooking the people whose work made that expansion possible. Black cowboys were reduced to footnotes or omitted entirely, their presence treated as an exception rather than a foundation. Over time, absence hardened into assumption, and assumption became belief. Generations grew up believing the West had been shaped by one kind of man, riding one kind of horse, living one kind of story. Yet memory has a way of surviving beneath silence. In photographs, letters, songs, and personal accounts, the truth remained. The techniques used in rodeos, the rhythms of trail life, and the unwritten codes of cowboy culture carried traces of those who had been excluded from the official narrative. Even as recognition faded, influence endured, embedded in practices passed from rider to rider. Discrimination did not erase the legacy of black cowboys, but it distorted how that legacy was remembered. Their absence from screens and pages was not accidental. It was the result of choices that favored simplicity over accuracy. Understanding this pattern reveals that the myth of the West was shaped as much by omission as by imagination. To confront this history is not to diminish the cowboy legend, but to restore its depth. The West was never the story of a single group. It was built through shared labor, unequal reward, and unrecognized excellence. Black cowboys lived at the heart of that contradiction, shaping a world that celebrated freedom while denying it in full. Their story remains essential, not because it corrects the past, but because it completes it. The story of black cowboys does not end on the open range or fade with the closing of the frontier. It continues today, carried forward by communities, historians, riders, and performers who refuse to let this history disappear again. What was once pushed to the margins is being reclaimed with purpose, pride, and clarity. Across the United States, Black-led rodeos, research initiatives, and cultural preservation efforts are restoring balance to the story of the American West, reaffirming that Black history is not a side chapter, but a central thread woven into the nation's identity. Modern Black rodeos stand as living bridges between past and present. Events inspired by pioneers like Bill Pickett showcase the same skills that once kept cattle drives moving: gripping, riding, speed, control, and courage, while celebrating the families and traditions that sustained those skills across generations. These rodeos are not reenactments. They are continuations. Each performance honors those who rode before, transforming memory into motion and history into lived experience. The cheers from the crowd echo voices that were once ignored, proving that excellence endures even when recognition was delayed. Alongside the arena, scholars and storytellers have taken up the work of preservation through archives, oral histories, photographs, and personal writings. Researchers are piecing together a fuller picture of the West as it truly was. Libraries, museums, and independent historians now highlight Black cowboys not as exceptions, but as essential contributors to frontier life. This research challenges long-standing myths and invites a deeper understanding of how the nation was built not by legend alone, but by labor, skill, and resilience. Cultural preservation extends beyond institutions into everyday life. Riding clubs, youth programs, parades, and community organizations pass down knowledge once learned on the trail. Young riders discover that the saddle carries more than tradition. It carries identity. Through music, storytelling, fashion, and sport, a new generation connects with a past that was nearly erased, finding strength in knowing that they belong to a legacy of builders, innovators, and survivors. What makes this legacy powerful is not only that it survives, but that it corrects the story. It reminds us that American history has never been singular or simple. The West was shaped by many hands, many cultures, and many voices. Recognizing Black cowboys does not take anything away from the American story, it completes it. It restores truth where myth once stood alone and replaces absence with acknowledgement. As this journey comes to a close, remember that history is not fixed. It is something we choose to explore, question, and share. By learning these stories and passing them forward, we help ensure they are never buried again. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to listen. If this story added something meaningful to your understanding of history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us as we continue uncovering stories that deserve to be remembered.